Ja, mensen binnen moeten ze nog.
Ja, ik ga het daar zetten.
Ja. I think we will share the microphones probably because we will. You will follow here on the stage and we will join us online. Should we push it? Yes.
Ja, perfect.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, good evening or good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Maybe you're also not in the present, but watching a video, because this is going to be recorded. That's also a warning. Okay. So I would like to welcome you to this round table on translating the Holocaust. And this is, for those who weren't there, a part of the three-day symposium Voicing the Silence on New Approaches in Russian and Ukrainian Literature on the Holocaust in the 21st Century. This roundtable is co-organized by CETRA. I represent that center. That's the Center of Translation Studies of the KU Leuven, the arts faculty. And we promote research on translational phenomena. The core business of CETRA is actually a summer school that we organize for PhD students and postdoctoral students who deal with all kinds of translational phenomena. CETRA also organizes and co-organizes a series of lectures and events and sometimes conferences. And we are very happy that we could also be taken on board for this event, for this round table. So I would like to thank, on behalf of CETRA, the conveners, the organizers of this symposium. And of course, I would like to thank the speakers here today. I think this roundtable will be of interest to our members and also to other translation study scholars, which is why we are going to record it and put the video on our website and on our blog. I think the speakers today, for those who are present here, do not need an introduction for obvious reasons, because all four speakers have given lectures today and yesterday, so I will not be long in introducing them to you, also because I think you will get to know them better during the roundtable. I would also like to give you the opportunity to present yourself and to provide us with the details you think are relevant for this roundtable from your biography or background. So at the right, for the people watching, we have Olga Buchina, who is a very active translator. She has translated many dozen of novels from English into Russian. She's also a children's author and an independent scholar based in New York. On the left, which is very confusing, the extreme left, I don't know if that's politically correct, but we have Yulia Ilchuk, who is assistant professor of Slavonic studies at Stanford University in California. And as a researcher, she's interested in the cultural exchange, interaction, and borrowing between Russia and Ukraine. We also have, also at the left, not extreme, but moderate left, Anya Tipner, professor of Slavic literatures at the University of Hamburg, and she specializes in representations of the Holocaust in a comparative perspective. We also, at the table, the round table, we have Mateusz Świetlicki. So welcome to you too, who is, as a scholar, affiliated with, if I'm correct, at least 3 universities, University of Toronto, Chicago, and Florida. I think it's Wrocław.
Historically speaking, yes.
Yeah.
But now I'm in Toronto, but originally I'm from Wrocław.
Originally from Wrocław, thank you.
Yes, and from the University of Wrocław, of course.
Mm-hmm. And right now, he's in Canada. He's working currently on a project entitled Remembering and Forgetting Images of Eastern Europe in North American Children's Literature. And that's maybe classified. He also has the coronavirus. That's why he's safe. We are safe. He's on the screen. So thank you, each and every one of you, for accepting the invitation of joining this round table. I think this round table will be a spontaneous conversation, and probably it will be a bit messy. We'll go with the flow. We didn't prepare a very clear structure. I just have some notes that I shared, and doubtlessly we will partly at least cover some ground that we have gone over before. We will revisit some bits, but also try to connect the dots and to exchange ideas. Also for didactic purposes, I think this is necessary because some people who will watch the video, who join us online, did not attend the previous lectures. So we will do this not in a mono-directional way, but in a multi-directional way. So we also will take questions from the audience here and online. You will get the opportunity of joining the conversation to be part of the roundtable. Maybe also by way of introductory note, maybe we should think about the concept of translation, because it's entitled, this roundtable is entitled Translating the Holocaust. So the question that arises is, what do you mean? What's translation? And I think we can advocate a very open notion of translation for the sake of the argument. Maybe first, in a metaphorical way, we are dealing with translation because we are referring to historical events that happened during the Second World War that are translated into a narrative, or rather into various narratives. So that's a translational movement, and then of course also translation plays a role in the way how this narrative or these narratives circulate across linguistic, national, cultural borders. And then we also have, of course, the possibility of translating this intersemiotically, because sometimes we have, for instance, screen adaptations from books, or you have talked about or mentioned graphic novels, which is a case of intersemiotic translation. So I would welcome all kinds of translations, so we can speak about many perspectives. But maybe first, by way of opening question, I would like to ask you what role the Holocaust and translation, in whatever sense you want to give it, what role does it play in your work, either as a researcher or as a translator? So could you briefly explain this to the audience? What's your relation to the Holocaust and to translation? How come you ended up doing this work or this research? Very briefly, Olga.
Okay, it's interesting to start, and it's a very loaded question for me because I'm a professional translator. Most of the books I translated is children's or young adult book, or sometimes even picture books, and I'm like on 50 plus published books now, and 2 of them are about Holocaust. And the very last, which I just finished recently, it's about Jewish life in the shtetl way before. But for me, it's a very kind of important topic. And as I was saying today, and I will repeat it, sorry for repetition, I translated it together with my sister and co-translator Galina Gimman. And we did 2 books, and both of them came out very recently, one in the end of the last year, one in the beginning of this year, and one of them is Lois Lowry's Numbers of Stars, and another one is Jane Yellen, Briar Rose. Both of the books are not memoirs, are not sort of connected to actual experience. It's American writers writing about somebody else's experience, really. And it brings this kind of idea of translation right immediately, because it's already translation. They mediate, they translate the experience of what they read in the books or heard from somebody. In Lois Lowry case, she heard it from the friend who was from Copenhagen, and it's not her story. She's just the protagonist of the book, a little bit like her friend, and her friend lived in that time. Jane Yellen doesn't have any direct relationship with Holocaust because her ancestry came to America a long time ago. They kind of translating Holocaust for children, in particular for American children. And what we do after that, we translate that sort of text for Russian children and teens. It's kind of double, triple translation. It's very kind of layered experience. And for me, it was very important because 2 books came to me differently. Jane Yellen, I was in New York, I live in New York, and I was in New York, and I was kind of browsing some kind of stall with books in the middle of, in the city, and the book just kind of jumped at me. I picked it up, started reading, and I knew that I want to translate it. I just want to translate it. And it took 10 years to find a publisher. And I gave it to my sister, she read it, and she started translating it without even idea that we will publish it ever, because we just fall in love with the book. The other book came to me very ordinary way. The publisher writes and say, will you translate a book for us? And that's Numbers of Stars, it's much more ordinary way. But both books became very dear to me because of my own experience and my kind of growing Jewish in Moscow, in Russia, you're growing in the shadow of the Holocaust, no matter what, because as I mentioned today, my father was wounded in the war, my grandfather was killed in a battle in the war, being a volunteer, and his father was killed in Ukraine by Nazis. I don't know how, because nobody knows how. And it's part of your family fabric. And I think I will stop here for a moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Olga. Anya?
Okay, thank you. I would like to start out with a thought that comes from my scholarly work on the Holocaust, being a Slavic scholar, also with an interest in translation and the way translation shapes our images of other literatures. And for me, it's very interesting and confusing to see that there is not enough translation regarding Holocaust literature. When we look at the encyclopedias of Holocaust literature, for example, there are only 2, 3, 4 books from Russian translated and incorporated into the world literature idea of Holocaust literature. There are very few books translated from Czech into English that make part of Holocaust literature. of the Canaan. The situation is a bit better when we take a look at Polish literature, but overall there are very different speeds and receptions. There are many blank spaces. We don't have a very incomplete picture and image of what Holocaust literature might be in Poland, because half of the books that form the Polish canon are not translated into German or English. They're not available, and we don't incorporate them in our thoughts, our ideas, our reflections on the Holocaust. So I would say there isn't, at least even at this point, not enough translation of Holocaust literatures. So, and I think our discussion is very sort of Anglo-centric, or in the case of Germany, Germanocentric, because we always talk about the books written in German and maybe in English. Safran Foer, there are about 10 books that are always mentioned when we speak about the Holocaust and literature, but that's a very small fraction of the books that have been written. And so I would say if we discuss the question of Holocaust and translation, we should also discuss how we could sort of further translation of Holocaust books into different languages, especially from Slavic languages. Ukrainian, for example, and I hand over.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anya.
Thank you.
And thank you, Peter, for your introductions. For me, my translation experience started in 2014. As a scholar, I was interested why Russophone writers and poets switched to write in Ukraine, and how they find their Ukrainian voice. So first of all, it was personal contact with Olena Styashkina, Volodymyr Rafeenko, Iakiva, who are all my country, like hometown people from Donetsk. So I just was engaged in the conversation with them to find why it's important for them to write in Ukrainian. And then after we started working closely with Iakiva, who also rediscovered her Jewish identity and her family history during the Holocaust only recently, it was important for me to translate her works not only from Ukrainian into English, but also how to find resources that she uses within Ukrainian or Russian, like Church Slavonicism or Yiddishism. So what does it mean to translate across languages and across cultures? So this is how I came to this project of translating Ukrainian poets who are writing about Holocaust, even without having a direct family history or experience. Kianovskaya's story that she became physically ill while writing her through the voices of Babin Yar, or Babin Yar through voices, because she described that she was basically physically exhausted while finding the appropriate language to talk about this trauma. So it's both in the Ukrainian case of Holocaust poetry, rediscovery of their own personal histories, but also internalizing the Jewish suffering in the context of this ongoing war in Ukraine, finding the relevant experience.
Okay, thank you, Julia. And maybe I can clarify, when you mentioned the ongoing war from an Ukrainian perspective, this is not something recent, but something that had started in 2014 and not...
I'm talking about writers who are from my region. It was occupied for 8 years, so they all left their homes in June or July of 2014. They're all refugees.
Okay, thank you. Mateusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That's a very difficult question. I would like to say that I really like the concept of transcultural translation, and that this is a concept which is really close to my research interests. And I have been studying books written for, like, books which Olga has mentioned, so books written for North American children, but books which talk about Eastern European history mostly, in which the authors have to translate, they have to translate the complex history and culture of the region and make it approachable to North American readers. So, and most of these books are about the Holocaust. And in my upcoming book, I study Ukrainian Canadian books about the Holocaust, but in 2 upcoming articles, I also write about Polish Canadian literature, in which the theme of the Holocaust is crucial, in which the theme of the Holocaust is described from the so-called Polish perspective, which is also quite problematic. Other than that, I've always been interested in the topic of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and I also have a personal connection to this history. Most of my great-grandparents were killed during the Holocaust and during the Second World War, depending on their national belonging, let's say. Also, it's quite interesting because the very first scholarly, let's say, thing which I did was a presentation on the representations of children in Holocaust-themed photography and film. That was my very first presentation, which I gave at while I was about to graduate from high school. So the topic of Holocaust has always been present in my life and in my career. And other than that, I have translated numerous articles, scholarly articles from English and from Ukrainian into Polish. So I'm also an active translator, but unlike Olga, I haven't really translated books for children. I'm a scholar. I'm writing about children's literature, but I have also translated more theoretical, let's say, texts.
Okay, thank you, Mateusz, and all the other experts. By way of opening question, or the second question, I would like to maybe draw on Mona Baker, who is a translation scholar and also the author of Translation and Conflict, a narrative account in which she thinks about the role that translations play in the way that narratives are shaped, but also challenged. And also she thinks about the ethical dimension for translators and interpreters of their work. But she also explicitly mentions the Holocaust as a master narrative, and she means that this is a narrative in which we are all embedded as contemporary actors in history. It's not her own research, but she explains that initially the Holocaust was reported to contemporaries as a war story. I quote, "nothing less but nothing more." But the element of evil in this historical narrative was so heavily weighted that the Holocaust became the dominant symbolic representation of evil in the late 20th century. The trauma for the Jewish people became a trauma for all human mankind. At the same time, we also know that narratives exist in very different versions, and this is something that I have learned also during the last 2 days, that maybe there is no such thing as a globalized version of the Holocaust narrative, and that we have very different narratives. We talked a lot about how the Soviet authorities blocked the Holocaust narrative by means of censorship and so on. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was an opportunity, or more opportunity, for various cultures that were under the Soviet umbrella to develop new narratives or to maybe change, modify narratives. So I would like to ask a very broad question, that is, because we spoke about Ukrainian narratives today, and we spoke about Russian Holocaust narratives too, but how do they relate to each other in the post-Soviet time, I mean? How do they differ? And maybe also, for instance, the Polish perspective on the Holocaust in the post-Soviet time. Is this something that still has something in common, or are we really speaking about very different narratives? So I don't know who would like to answer first. Maybe I'm looking at Julia and Anya as well.
I'm very novice to the Holocaust studies, let's say. So I can only comment on the Ukrainian treatment and discovery of new resources. So most of the poets who are writing about Holocaust, they exist between cultures since birth. So they either bilingual, like Khersonsky and Kiva, or they just cultured in the way to accept the suffering of others. Like Rafeenka, Stashkina. Rafeenka is a professor of ethics and Stashkina is a history professor, so like academics. So that's why we are talking about more about the more intellectual, right, culture that probably exists for a very close circle of like-minded people. So they don't need to create a lot of context to be understood. So, for example, when Iya is writing on the themes of Holocaust, she brings into her poetry the conventional topics and conventional images of Ukraine as a prostitute girl that Taras Shevchenko created in his poem Katerina. But in Kiva's interpretation, the contemporary image of Ukraine appears as a Jewish girl, Hannah, who is surviving the Holocaust. So you need to have really the cultural and historical competence to go through the layers of meaning, as well as dealing with Khersonsky's poems as well. So that's why I feel like they're not creating a universal language because they all have idiosyncratic style. And the role of the translator actually to bring up this context and to show these layers. And it's still for me the task to respond to, because I don't want to ask these poets what exactly you put into this, like, can you please comment what's going on in the poem, because it's a cheating, right? So, but I understand that if I don't get the meaning, my reader, who will read it in English translation, have even less knowledge than I am, so I need to create more context. And me and my co-translator, Amelia Glazer, we are trying to find resources in English to bring this multicultural history. I have some examples, but I'm not sure. I'm not going to analyze them, but probably we can pass. It's my translation in the dual.
Yeah, let's pass them around. Maybe later
I had
you can
some
read them
understanding
aloud.
that we can go through the translations and just discuss them together.
Would you like to read it aloud?
Maybe like when we talk.
Yeah, okay.
When
Okay, thank you. So it's very embedded in Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian Holocaust narrative, not easy to translate.
It's easy to translate. It's difficult to communicate the meaning. Mm-hmm. Definitely. So the language-wise, there is nothing complex about these structures. But how to find, for example, resources for «Плачет дитятка в костёле», the last line. So first we thought it's Jesus who is being born, right? So and we use the biblical language, and then we also struggle to find the equivalent for костёл, because, you know, in normative language you just need to use church, but for her it was important that finally, this is about the death of her father, the murder of her father, who was Jewish Lithuanian, but he didn't have developed national or ethnic identity during the Soviet time, and only after his death, he kind of discovered this family history. And the two lines, when the Kalmius, the river in Donetsk, merges with a river in Lithuania, he is being born in Polish cathedral, so right, a Jew. So this is kind of baptism by death. So there is a lot going on in terms of reference, right? And just the straightforward translation cannot communicate all this complexity. So this is what I'm telling.
Okay, thank you. Anya, you specialize in comparing Holocaust narratives. What would you say the differences are between Polish, for instance, Polish, Russian and Ukrainian post-Soviet narratives on Holocaust?
That's really complicated and very broad, and I'm not a specialist in Ukrainian literature, but when I, for example, compare Czech and Polish Holocaust narratives, it becomes apparent that every literature, every Holocaust text is also shaped by national traditions, national forms of narration, national discussions that are and that's somewhat contradicts the idea put forward by sort of the globalization of the Holocaust. We have at once a globalization of the Holocaust, but we also have discussions going on in Poland, which are very different from the ones going on in the Czech Republic, for example. When I look at Czech texts, then I can see that Czech authors since the 2000s have started to think about and link the Holocaust with the expulsion of the ethnic Germans, which is something in German literature seems to be inconceivable of. But for Czech authors, there seems to be a clear link, maybe given just temporarily, because there are these two coincidences, the war and the Holocaust, and the expulsion of the ethnic Germans. So they fuse these stories into one. And if you look at this, as I said, from a German perspective, there was a big taboo even speaking and talking about the expulsion of Germans from Poland or the Czech Republic, so we would never, I can't think of an author in German literature who would do this, who would link the Holocaust with this topic. Or, whereas, and maybe Mateusz will talk about this when it comes to Polish attitudes, in Poland there are other stories that are linked and fused with the Holocaust because there is this geographical or temporary link that that shapes these stories, and it makes them maybe sometimes more difficult to translate because you need two contexts. You not only need the Holocaust context, but you need the other contexts that are important for the authors in creating their stories. And this is the extraordinary challenge of the translator to have these different contexts in mind, and also to be aware of certain traditions, literary, aesthetic, poetic, that also shape the Holocaust narrative. But for me, this is what makes these texts so interesting, because they're not uniform. They, in many ways, diverge from what we have come to expect as the Holocaust narrative. So.
Okay, thank you. And I think, Mateusz, you can take it from here to say a few words about the Polish narrative.
Sure, I can say a few words about Poland and also North America, because absolutely the Holocaust is a master narrative, and it's present in various different countries, various different cultures and contexts, in children's literature in general, in many different places. When it comes to the main differences, I think, between Poland and Ukraine is that in Poland, the topic of the Holocaust appeared, of course, I'm talking about the post-Soviet period. So I'm not talking about the pre-Soviet period and the pre-Soviet literatures. So after the collapse of communism, the topic of the Holocaust appeared way earlier in Poland than in Ukraine, and there are way more Polish books, and I'm talking about books for older readers and for children, and picture books, especially in the last decade. Many new books were published, and some of them have been critically acclaimed, won numerous awards. But in Poland, in the last 30 years, the memory of the Holocaust and the Second World War had to be reframed, reconstructed, and I think that it's just something that Poland has only started to do. When it comes to the local things, which Anya has mentioned, of course, in Polish literature, quite often there are references to the Warsaw Uprising or other important events, to important people like Irena Sendlerowa or Janusz Korczak, so important figures, figures who are recognized by the majority of Polish children and Polish adults and young adults. Canadian literature is very interesting, and the Holocaust themed Canadian literature, because in most of these books, Canada functions as a frame. So there are always mentions of Canada. So there are always kind Canadian soldiers. The characters have family in Canada. Canada is always there. In many American books, there are kind American soldiers. There are also uncles and aunts from America. So I think that this is interesting because the Holocaust is a very distant topic, thinking about North America, historically, geographically, culturally. So to make this topic approachable, contemporary authors tend to include references to popular culture, very often to things that children may recognize. Unfortunately, quite frequently, these books contain numerous historical inaccuracies. So there's always this question, what is more important, spreading awareness or making sure that the books are historically accurate? And unfortunately, because of this focus on the local things and making the Holocaust approachable, many of these books become just historically inaccurate, which is problematic because these books very often are translated into other languages. Because let's be honest, it's more likely for a book which is in English to be translated into 50 languages than a book which was originally written in Russian or Ukrainian or Polish.
Okay, or Dutch, for instance. We'll speak about that later. But first, I would like to give the... Yeah, sure.
May I add something? Because it refers to the Holocaust in Ukraine, and we always have this, because Mateusz was speaking about the master narrative, the Holocaust master narrative, and we have seen, and we've discussed this these past 2 days, that the Holocaust master narrative usually is centered around the camps, around Auschwitz as the master sign. But we have a very different Holocaust in Ukraine, for example, or in some parts of Poland, which we call the Holocaust by bullets. And there are very few literary representations of this type of Holocaust. So we all would be hard-pressed to name an American novel or a German novel that really deals with the Holocaust by bullets, because it hasn't made part of this master narrative. The master narrative is one about the camps, and it's a Polish master narrative. And even Theresienstadt, about which we talked, doesn't belong to this master narrative, which is really shaped by the imagery of the death camps and the camps in Poland. So we should also talk about translating and integrating this other type of Holocaust into the Holocaust master narrative. And this is really something that needs to be done. And these Ukrainian texts are working on this. So that's just an addendum.
Thank you. It's very valuable. Would you say that the role of collaborators is also not a part of the master narrative?
I mean, collaborators and complicity is a very fraught topic, and I think Polish literature is trying to come to terms with these questions, discussing this via questions of appropriating Jewish objects. There's a big discussion going on about, and texts, they're great Polish texts, sort of representing this topic of collaboration and implicitness via the appropriation of Jewish objects. So I think obviously collaboration is a very difficult topic which touches upon other stories and other histories, and yeah, speaking from a German perspective, we can see that it takes generations to come to terms with your own guilt in this way. So I'm not the one to speak about and judge Polish or Ukrainian or Czech authors in the way they deal with complicitness and collaboration.
It sounds quite optimistic, if I may say, because you say it takes generations, which suggests that we're heading towards the right direction. On the other hand, there is, like, for instance, the defamation law, which was passed in Poland, which basically makes it an offense to speak too openly about the role of the Polish people in the Holocaust. If I interpret this correctly, so you can always correct me. But maybe I would now like to give also the question to Olga, because you translate books, children's books, you have translated from English into Russian, and they circulate not only in the Russian Federation, but for instance also in Ukraine. Do you feel that there is a difference in the way that they are received, and does this relate to a different national, if I can say this, Holocaust narrative, or not?
Yeah, let me turn the whole thing upside down, basically, because it's a kind of opposite thing, because Russia, as we discussed today, doesn't really produce Holocaust narrative for children. There's here and there a little bit pieces, mentioning, but there's no like book about Holocaust which addressed to children written in Russian in last 20 years. But there's a lot of translated books. And what's happening, because as we talked today earlier, Russian publishers, Russian readers, Russian scholars, they're interested into discussing difficult topics with children. They're interested in discussing difficult historical topics with children. Myself as a scholar, not as the translator, I write about orphans in children's literature. I just finished a book about death in children's literature, and Holocaust is a big part of that discussion, because you cannot really discuss, the position of orphan in children's literature or situation with death in children's literature, and not to mention Holocaust. And Holocaust became that exactly master narrative, but not for itself. It became a master narrative for other books on Russian topics. It brings the possibility to write about Stalin's time, to write about various atrocities which happened in the Russian history using the model of the Holocaust. And for that, even though, of course, we still have just a few dozen children's books translated into Russian, but it's kind of enough to create the field, to create the possibility to use the model and use that model to produce a dozen books about Russian history. But I will give the example, actually not from the children's books, where it's very clear how it works, using the Holocaust as a master narrative, because we already mentioned graphic novels, and that's kind of another level of translation or rendering into different media, almost. Art Spiegelman Mouse was translated into Russian in 2013, and was kind of the only first one out of two. In the same 2013, Persepolis which was by Satrapi, which was very heavily influenced by Maus, but very different story, was translated into Russian. And both books kind of were well received. But in 2019, the very first political graphic novel in Russian appeared. It's not for children, but it can be read by young adults as Maus and as Persepolis. It's kind of addressed to young adults, first of all. And it uses the same, you can really see that from Maus and Persepolis to that book. It's called Survilo. It's the last name of the main character. And it's done by the granddaughter. Her name is Olga Lavrentieva, and she's drawing and describing the story of her grandmother, Valentina Survilo, who was in Stalin's camp, and using kind of the same type of imagery. And that's kind of how the Holocaust became a master narrative for Russian. You know, it doesn't work in a way like American produced master narrative of Holocaust. It's a template how to write about it in Russian. And it helps a lot because Russian literature really needs some kind of like opening, loudness, you know, like permission to do it, if I may say, because of all the kind of political turmoils in Russia. It's very difficult to start. But when you see, it's just finish one line, kind of, it's very typical in Russia, generally speaking, historically. It starts with translation from the 19th century, you know, especially in children's literature. It's very clearly, you know, there's translation from German and French of children's literature. Later on, Russian writers start writing first in the same style, later on it's very original literature. The same happening in the post-Soviet time. The same people who were translating, I don't know, detective stories for children. 3 years later, they write their own detective story, absolutely Russian detective stories for children. And I think something happening with the Holocaust narrative in a very similar way, you know, like you start from translating, and one of the translators, probably not me, but one of the translators will be able to write for children, you know, the Holocaust narrative of Russia, or kind of the former Soviet Union, but for young adult and children.
So translation is a way to broaden the repertoire, to import new models which are needed to speak about certain things.
Yeah, don't forget that Russia still has the highest translated index or something, you know, percentage of the book which, you know, the percentage of the book which translated out of all book published, it still goes like 45, I don't know. Sometimes it's 60%, 50%, 40%, which is one of the highest in the world, probably. You know, that's why translated literature is that important to Russia, traditionally from like more than a century and a half.
Would you say that in Ukraine it's the same story, or is it different?
You know, I don't really know because, and I cannot tell, you know, I think a lot of translated literature before the 2014, a lot of children's literature which was translated into Russian was sold in Ukraine, sold in Belarus, you know, it was kind of common field, and very consciously common field in that sense because, you know, enough children were able to read Russian. I don't think it's true now because of the conflict, because it's kind of just not possible. And I think Ukraine is much faster in producing their own Holocaust voice, at least in adult literature. I don't see any Holocaust poetry coming out of Russia. There's like whole kind of, maybe I just don't know, but there's a whole kind of stream of Holocaust poetry coming from Ukraine. I think Ukraine has a very different, and thank God Ukraine has a very different way of doing than Russia, and I just hope it will be a different way. You know, but you need to ask Ukrainian colleagues.
A couple of months ago, I have a 10-year-old daughter who goes to primary school, and a couple of months ago she was asked to give a presentation, and she could choose a topic in the list, and apparently she chose Anne Frank, and I was quite surprised that at that age, 10-year-old, at school it was encouraged to give a presentation about Anne Frank because of the atrocities that you get to know when you learn about her fate, like the death camps and so on, extermination camps. That was a word that my daughter learned. I was also surprised positively that apparently Anne Frank is still considered important, and it's one of the most translated books because you have translations in over 70 languages. How can we explain this dazzling success of Anne Frank? And also, and this relates also to what you just mentioned, you have graphic novels and so on. Is this still possible for in the long term? I mean, to keep this image alive, or will, I don't know, movies and graphic novels take over? Or has children's literature still an important role to play to keep the memory alive? I don't know.
I would love to start on it because, I read Anne Frank when I was about 10 or 11, and it was a very important book for me. And it's recently was made into the graphic novel, and it was translated into Russian and published in Russian before it was translated and published in America. I don't know about English publication, but I learned about Russian publication. I went to look at the English text, and I couldn't find it. And they told me, yes, translated, but it will come out in another half a year. And Russian already picked the book up. It's still totally relevant. And I was telling earlier today that I just heard that it was translated in Afghanistan and read in underground book clubs for girls, and give courage to them. And I think the text is still working, it became part of literature. You remember the fate is in our stars, that sort of novel about the girl who died from cancer, and the whole novel it's American novel. The whole novel is shaped around Anne Frank and her the girl visiting Amsterdam and getting her courage to sort of live very short life, and she knows that she will die very soon, and she takes courage out of the Anne Frank story. I think it's still very relevant, and maybe in Russia, especially now, when sort of for those people who feel that life in Russia is kind of going wrong way, it may be even more important that children would read it and understand how dangerous it can be when it goes a wrong way. Because I think the Holocaust literature right now is so relevant in Russia because it's kind of warning, this very, very severe warning. If you go this way, that's the way you will end up. But I hope children read it.
Okay, thank you.
May I?
I want to mention the popularity of survival memoirs during this stage of the war that published parallel to the survival narratives of the recent prisoners of the war. For example, the journalist from Donetsk, Aseev, who survived the torture prison in Izolyatsya, as popular as the Holocaust narratives during this, stage of the war. So this is again the point of my argument that why this literature became so popular after 2014, because Ukrainians found themselves in this impossible situation of surviving, and not only those who dared to publish their memoirs, but also all kinds of stories disseminated by social media. Like read today about a girl who survived filtration camp in Mariupol. So people start to realize that they're not unique in their experiences, and that's why how they rediscover the Holocaust literature in the Ukrainian case.
Okay, thank you. Mateusz, yeah?
Yes, yeah, may I add something about Anne Frank? I want to share some interesting statistics with you. So according to 2019 survey, 22% of Canadian people aged 18-34 don't know, are not sure what the Holocaust was, but 82% have heard the name Anne Frank, which is very interesting, I think, and shows how popular Anne Frank as a person, as a hero of let's say the imagination, of North Americans is. And I think that the popularity of Anne Frank is in many countries is connected to the fact that her diary is in the school curricula. So in most states, in most provinces in Canada, too, her Anne Frank's diary is in the curriculum. So children read it at school, so they know it. But it very often is the only text they know about the Holocaust, which is also problematic. When it comes to Anne Frank and Ukraine, I know that the diary has been translated into Ukrainian at least 3 times, but the last translation appeared almost 20 years ago. And I don't think that it has become as popular as in other countries. But there are also other, books translated, other memoirs, let's say, translated into Ukrainian. But I just don't think that Anne Frank is as well known in Ukraine as, or even in Poland, as she is in the Western world. I think that Anne Frank is a phenomenon in the so-called. I'm using, of course, the word Western very loosely. So she's a phenomenon in the Western world, but I don't think that she is such a big phenomenon in the eastern part of Europe. And I think this is quite telling.
Thank you, Mateusz. Yeah. If you would like to jump in, go ahead. No?
Excuse
Okay.
me, Peter. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah, Paula?
Yes. Hello. Hi, everyone. I would like to ask you questions because I am currently, I'm sorry, I'm just going to introduce myself very briefly. I am Paula Gentile, lecturer of Dutch Studies at University of Trieste, and I'm following this very interesting roundtable from my office, which is about to close right now. So I would like to ask a very short question to Mateusz about the last thing you mentioned. Why do you think that Anne Frank is not so popular in the post-Soviet countries as it is in the Western countries? Right now, I am currently setting up a project about the translations and retranslations of Anne Frank's diaries in Italian. And there is a lot to say about it, also because Italy was a fascist country, and the reception has changed continuously over the years throughout the 20th century. And now many more translations are appearing. So that's why I'm interested in the perspectives about the diaries. Thank you.
Maybe
Sounds like an amazing project.
Yeah, Mateusz, would you like to, because it's a question for you, I think, in the first place, would you like to answer this?
Of course, I'll be more than happy to try to answer it. It's a very good question. I think that, as I've already said, it's really connected to the school curricula in the so-called school canon. There are many other local books in the Polish school canon. So it's not, don't get me wrong, children in Poland know about the Holocaust and they read Holocaust-related texts, but these are usually local texts. And in these local texts, there are Polish characters. And I think that it's easier for children from this particular cultural context, to identify with they're with local, let's say, characters, with local names. And then this topic becomes more, I don't know, tangible. In Anne Frank, it's, it's the West. It's not as close. So culturally, I think it's also easier for the teachers to discuss locally produced, let's say, texts, which are deeply rooted in the local context. I think that it's just connected to the curricula and the choices teachers, librarians, ministers of education make, really.
Okay.
That's the most logical, I think, answer. The most logical one.
Yeah, I think Barbara now wants to add something. Barbara, would you like to use the microphone? Otherwise, the people who join us online will not be able to hear your question.
To some extent, I agree with Mateusz, but the truth is that fragments of Anne Frank are at least for 15 years in the handbooks for teaching Polish language and literature at schools. So that's the other side of the story. So I don't think Anne Frank is an unknown topic in Poland. But you're right, these local-based texts, and when I was going to school, we were reading other texts about the Holocaust and Holocaust, maybe not about Holocaust, but about Second World War with the Poles and the myth of yes, resistance myth. It was the dominant narrative, but it changed at the end of the 20th century, so that's just an addendum.
I just want to add that I did not say that Anne Frank is unknown in Poland. I just said that the other local narratives are the dominant ones. Yeah, but Abasha is absolutely right that she is known. But let's say when I was in high school, so now you'll see that I'm not 20. When I was in high school, we did not read Anne Frank, but I know that more and more younger people know Anne Frank also because of other texts and this transcultural, let's say, translation. And here I'm, of course, referring to the graphic novel, which Olga has mentioned, or some other adaptations or intertextual references to Anne Frank in other books like Zlata's Diary and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Mateusz, and Paula as well for this question. And maybe I would now like to speak a bit, but we have spoken already about it, about the Russian-Ukrainian war, because it's important, and I think also this symposium has changed under the influence of the recent events, because initially it was meant to deal not with Ukrainian literature, if I'm not mistaken, but then it was felt that it should also be about Ukrainian literature and not just about Russian literature. So the question that I would like to ask first is how is what's happening right now becoming a turning point for Ukrainian and Russian literature and also for the memorization of Holocaust in this literature. And to a certain extent, I think Anya has also already given us a response with regard to the Ukrainian situation because it fuels the Holocaust narrative because people can relate to it and search for examples. The question remains, how does this impact the Russian Holocaust narrative? And Olga, you sounded quite optimistic because you said that this kind of children's literature is needed now to speak about the atrocities and to make people think about this. On the other hand, there is also a reason for pessimism because we have a rich Russian culture, a very rich Russian literature, and still we have this war, we have the atrocities of Bucha, and they happened. And according to some critics, Russian literature is to be blamed for this. Or partly, for instance, the Russian journalist and culture scholar Andrei Arkhangelsky recently, in August, published an opinion piece on the website of Radio Liberty, Svoboda, under the title "Не распознав зло," and he says, maybe I do not write by him by giving this Mickey Mouse black and white version of his nuanced opinion piece, but he says that Soviet culture has never taught people to recognize evil that exists in each and every one of us, and that the problem of evil was not dealt with properly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia, that it was solved dangerously by embracing immorality. He generalizes, of course, in the sense that violence became the right of the strong ones. So the question that I would like to ask is, do you think that there is some kind of shared cultural responsibility? And how can, in the midst of war, literature, let alone translated literature, make a difference?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I'm very surprised that I sound optimistic, because normally I sound very pessimistic. And I didn't mean to be optimistic, because I'm not. But I wouldn't blame culture, because it's kind of, I unfortunately didn't read that interview. Arkhangelsky, I know of him, but let me try to talk about it in all seriousness. You know, Russian culture, and it's how we define culture. If we define culture as like everything what's going on in the country, yes, that's one story. If we talk about literature, you know, the entire world defined evil and good by Dostoevsky. That's Russian literature. And kind of like, you know, the whole world discussed Tolstoy, you know, what's good, what's bad. It's Russian literature. And I jump immediately to children's literature because that's my domain. And for last 10, 15 years, and I was already telling this to somebody during the coffee break, you know, publishing houses, dozens of publishing houses in Moscow were translating and solicit original Russian literature, which would tell children about evil in the world, about difficult things, about difficult things in the families, difficult things in the world. It was direct books about the war, direct books about the Holocaust, direct books about all possible atrocities existing. And, you know, when this war started on February 24th, one of the publisher, Compass, did the very first thing. In 2 weeks, they republished the book which they published 10 years ago, a French book called Brown Morning. I don't remember the French name, Коричневое утро, about the fascism which coming, which like is like a, you know, little fairy tale or about fascism. You know, what I want to say that big group of writers, translators, people who were active researchers, you know, students, people, parents, teenagers who were active in children's literature were kind of feeling that nothing good is coming. You know, we all knew that something bad coming. We were trying to publish as many books as we could, as many good translations as we could, to talk about as many difficult topics we can. It's a drop in the ocean, because it's just, again, dozens of publishing houses in Moscow. It's pretty impossible. Sisyphus, like, you know, you remember this guy with the stone, Sisyphus, you know, because every time in Russia you try to put up that stone, it drops on you. But generally speaking, and I don't want, you know, to say that, oh, we're not guilty. We are guilty. We're all guilty of that horrible thing which is happening right now. It's a war and it's horror, you know. And I don't live in Russia for 25 years and I still feel responsible for it. Even kind of objectively speaking, I'm an American citizen. I could just go away. But again, you know, living in America, what American book is responsible for the Vietnam War? I don't know. You know, Steinbeck, Hemingway, I don't know. You know, I'm asking the same question. What culture produced, you know, what? And the answer I'm coming with, and and I actually got that formula from one of my American relatives, my sister-in-law. No, it's not Russian culture. It's Russian imperialism. It's Russian militarism. It's Russian political system. Yes, they're absolutely guilty. But I wouldn't blame culture from Pushkin on. Whatever they wrote for their time, and whatever contemporary writers write right now, adult or, there's some people who push, aggressiveness in their books, and some people who push, reconciliation and peace in their books. And it's always a proportion, in any culture. But that Russia is an empire, and it was the Russian Empire, it was the Soviet Union, and its post-Soviet Union empire, and a desire to be empire again. That's really what caused that war, to my opinion, and that's to be blamed. And what literature could do, as long as we don't have full censorship in Russia, we can publish whatever we can, bring it to children, to teach more, to publish more, to, disseminate more, as long as we stand, as long as there's any money to buy paper. And it's a horrible economical peril as well, because children's publishing is basically collapsing because of the prices, And again, it's very good to have a blockade of Russia, but, but children's publishing, best children's publishing cannot buy paper as well, But people, and I know that publishers trying to register their, publishing houses abroad, that they will be able to do it. They just had a festival of Russian children's literature in Israel, because half of the people who were actually active in publishing in Russia, in Moscow, are in Israel right now, because they all exiled. They're trying as much as they can. Sorry, that was a long, very pessimistic answer.
I would like to thank you for this. Would you like to add something to that?
I think Arkhangelsky was speaking from his own position, because he doesn't depend on any state funding. He produces documentary films and TV programs using private resources. And one of his projects that he was engaged right before the war is bringing the theme of famine in Russia and Kazakhstan and Ukraine to Russian audience. So he was visiting different archives. So I think like he knows what he's talking about. I think like this is the moment to consider Ukrainian culture input into the Eastern European studies as autonomous culture and decouple it from Russia for at least like for time being until the war is over. And I think like a lot of institutions now are very interested in publishing translations, organizing conference, poetry reading, and giving voice to the Ukrainian writers without bringing Russian writers on the same stage. So I think it's also a positive change that for a moment they became suddenly more visible. So I'm hopeful that this will last even when the war is over. And then literature will play its role in finding grounds for reconciliation. So I don't have any vision of role of the culture, because both post-Soviet societies are in a deep crisis in terms of finding the institutions, archival and educational and libraries. They're underfunded and they rely on their private resources. So we cannot blame lack of awareness, right, in Russian culture. So I just don't want to generalize, because very kind of narrowed, my vision narrowed by urgent topics of surviving through this historical moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Anya?
Yeah, I think something that he was addressing too is that in Russia, in Soviet culture, the addressing evil and good was more difficult, because we and this has been part of the Holocaust narrative. There's this clear-cut opposition of perpetrators and victims, and we knew very well they're the Nazis and they're the perpetrators, and we have the victims that are the Jews, and it's very easy to sort these two sides. But in Russian Soviet culture, Ukrainian Soviet culture, perpetrators and victims tended to be very complicated groups, because you could be a perpetrator and in the next minute become a victim, and the other way around. So addressing this question of good and evil is much more fraught and complicated in this Soviet context, I would say, which makes addressing it more complicated. So and we can see this even now during the war, working through the historical context is difficult. I see one thing to add, a positive thing, is I see also there's a lot of translation. We heard an example in Julia's presentation today and in the other presentations, the way theory has been translated into literature, and we can see that modern post-Soviet Ukrainian, Russian novels have taken up theories of memorialization, of memory studies, concepts like Marian Hirsch's concept of post-memory, transgenerational transmission. And you can see that books like, for example, Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory is a book that tries exactly to do that, to translate these theories of memory studies into literature and use them to address these difficult topics and to navigate these complicated issues of nationality, transnationality, perpetratorship, and victimhood, which are all combined in one family. And as we heard by the testimonies given today by Marina and Olga and also Julia, it's a story almost every Soviet and post-Soviet family can tell. So I think there is a way that comes via the translation of historical findings like Omar Bartov's or literary theory and cultural theory into literature to start a new discussion.
Thank you, Anya. Mateusz, do you have anything to add to this?
This is a very difficult question, and it's connected to all of these entanglements, of the past and the present and the future. We're talking about the Holocaust, and we know that many sites of memory in Ukraine have been destroyed now. So the Holocaust is a part of this war. When places like Babin Yar and other sites of memory are being destroyed, it's connected, and later on we'll have to reconstruct the past and reconstruct the present, which will become the past, and reconciliation will be necessary, but it's difficult. Talking about reconciliation now is very difficult. Talking about the past is also very difficult, because everyone is so focused on what is happening now, and what is happening now is terrible. It's awful, and we all know that Putin has been using the Holocaust in his anti-Ukrainian agenda for years. So the Holocaust is is directly linked to what is happening now, and that's why we should be talking about it. It's something that we cannot not talk about.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, I think, but maybe the audience still has one or two very urgent questions. If not, then I think we will conclude this roundtable, and I would like to thank all the participants, because it was a very long day for you, very fruitful discussion. So Julia, Anya, Mateusz, and Olga, thank you so much, and I think we soon will head to the participants of the symposium, not the people who join us online, will head to the restaurant now.
Okay.
So
And
thanks
a lot to you, Peter, for preparing the roundtable, for managing all the topics. And we will put it online. It will be a great resource, I think, for everyone interested in the nexus between translation and the Holocaust. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again.